Hello and welcome to Session 4, Workshop 10, Empowering Readers and Writers to Independently Seek Challenge. If you are enjoying the learning today, you can pay the joy forward by going to the EdCollab site and finding out how you can donate to our adopted charities for today. Because the EdCollab gathering is a day of free learning, we invite you to donate what you would have spent on coffee, lunch, or even registration for an amazing day like this to pay the joy forward. Today we welcome Maggie Beatty Roberts and Julia E. Torres for their session, Empowering Readers and Writers to Independently Seek Challenge. These two really need no introduction, but for the sake of formality, Maggie and Julia are both members of the Educator Collaborative Network. Maggie is a national literacy consultant, author, and frequent presenter at state and national conferences. She's co-author of DIY Literacy, Teaching Tools for Differentiation, Rigor, and Independence with Kate Roberts, as well as many other works. You can learn more about Maggie's work, as well as access videos and other resources at kateandmaggie.com. Julia is an expert in secondary writing and reading instruction, including accelerated reading and writing instruction for multilingual students and those learning in urban environments. She's a teacher librarian for 5 Denver public schools. Julia has also taught creative writing and African American literature at the University of Colorado Denver's Upward Bound Pre-Collegiate Summer Academic Institute. If you are on Twitter today, you can share your learning using the hashtag #TheEdCollabGathering, a space, and hashtag 10. And now I'm excited to introduce Maggie Beatty Roberts and Julia E. Torres to the EdCollab Gathering.
Hi, everybody.
Hey!
Hey! Really exciting to be here.
Yes.
Let's do this, Maggie.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, cool. So we're here. We love the Ed Collab. We are excited to bring some information to you today about reading and writing and empowering learners to independently seek challenge. So during this session, you're going to learn how to empower young readers, learning to independently seek out and engage in challenge at each level of the development of their reading lives and identities.
And then in the writing portion, we're really focusing on empowering young writers to speak and structure and understand their writing and writing process through a greater sense of purpose, challenge, and independence.
As you heard, I am a teacher librarian in Denver Public Schools. I'm a 16-year language arts teaching veteran. I'm your current NCTE secondary representative at large if you are a member of NCTE. I am a 2018-2020 Heinemann Fellow and currently the Educator Collaborative Book Ambassador. You can tweet at me using @JuliaAaron80. And then our hashtag for this session is hashtag #TheEdCollabGathering number 10.
And I'm Maggie Beatty Roberts. I taught middle school in Chicago public schools. I am from the Midwest originally, and then I moved out to go to school in New York City and ended up staying. I ended up working at the Reading and Writing Project as a staff developer for about 10 years. And now I feel like my favorite role is guest teaching in classrooms all around the Northeast and a little bit all around the country, and engaging with teachers as they study student work and think about methods of teaching and curriculum development. And I am just the bee's knees happy to be hanging out with my friend Julia and learning from her. You know, when it came down to thinking about who might want to take reading and who might want to take writing, there was no question in my mind. Julia is such an unbelievable resource of all things literature and reading and literacy and equity. And I'm really excited to be presenting with you.
And I feel the same way. I think we've always clicked.
Yes.
And it's been amazing to be able to be together in real life, the times that we have been, but it's just awesome to be able to present this way too, because folks can get a sense for the strengths that we both bring to this topic and the energy that I feel we have, the passion we both have for this subject. So excited.
So it's kind of gonna go like, Julia is gonna take the lead and then I will come in for the writing and we'll go back and forth like that. So I say kick it off, Julia.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. So we're going to be talking about common barriers first. So why some students avoid seeking challenge. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that the teaching experience, it's got to be reciprocal, right? So when we're looking for reciprocity, the teacher does get that great soul, heart happy feeling when students respond to what we're doing. But it's also got to be a process of reciprocal learning and reciprocal vulnerability. If we're always asking students to be vulnerable and to take risks, but we aren't willing to take them ourselves because we hold all of the power, all of the knowledge, that's not really fair, and it doesn't really lead to reciprocity. So this quote is something that Maggie and I talked a little bit about. It is by me, so Maggie insisted that I put my name on there.
Put your name on that. I was like, was that you? You get your name on that.
I put my name on it, but really knowledge belongs to everyone. So I'm happy to pass it on to all of you. We often avoid challenge because it creates feelings of discomfort. We cannot always remove discomfort, but we can gradually support students in engaging with discomfort through providing language supports, attaching systems and structures that incorporate challenge or discomfort to regular, comfortable routines, and providing opportunities for leadership, shifting power. So these are the three things that Maggie and I are gonna really just come back to repeatedly throughout the session, sort of a frame for us and a framework for thinking about this. You can, think about your everyday life, think about when you have had the language to be able to speak about something that you're curious about. So having the language is a huge part of feeling empowered to be able to step into your personal power and to engage in discomfort. And then when we attach something that is unfamiliar or uncomfortable to a recognized system, environment, way of doing things that is comfortable, then that's another way that you can sort of put some nice pillows or cushions around someone and help soften any kind of perceived falls that they might be anticipating. Because when we're avoiding challenge, it's really that we're just afraid of failure. So when you feel, and I've always heard people say, when you fear something, you give it wings. So when you are afraid of something, you are actually giving it, putting it out there into the universe that this is a possibility for coming true. So one of the things that we can think about when we are trying to avoid challenge, or when students are trying to avoid challenge, and when teachers are avoiding it, is the idea of connecting the familiar and the unfamiliar. When we are talking about reading, that looks several different ways, and we'll talk more about that later. However, I put a little quote in here from one of my faves, Bell Hooks. And sometimes her name is spelt with one L, sometimes with two. So just folks should know that. Education as a practice of freedom. That's something that is a core belief of mine and many other folks, but what does that really mean? Are you really free if you're only allowing your students to do things or to experience reading within these really tight constraints that you put around them? If you have to maintain control at all times, you are not allowing for that space of vulnerability for students or yourself, or for that space of growth, because you're not even sure that growth is possible. So, and what I mean by that is when we're thinking about fluency, people like to put rigid boxes around what that looks like and what that means. Discussion, people like to judge students on what they should and shouldn't be discussing. And it's really important, and we'll talk about this more again later, when we're thinking about discussion, how can we be as inclusive and expansive as possible? We want to coach students how to make meaning, how to write about reading, because that's something we do a lot. We teach reading to inform students thinking about how to write. And then style analysis is another one that we come back to again and again. And how do we understand and apply the rules of reading to all types of reading? That's something that all students of all ages can benefit from. So we're going to look at each of these areas and try to sort of remix thinking about it so that we think of it in new ways.
And, for me, it wasn't a stretch to think about all the reasons why writing is a challenge, or like when writing is challenging, because, there's just so much that happens when you are composing writing that is challenging in and of itself. And to then seek additional challenge on something that might already be hard, it felt important to give space of why that is a challenging thing to do. And I was thinking about three things. One, this quote by Mel Levine, writing is the largest orchestra a kid's mind has to conduct. I have a 5-year-old who is in kindergarten for the first time. I watch him go through writing workshop and reading workshop and math and, just all the things that have to come together as a human when you write, like in terms of like what your brain is doing, your ability to organize, your ability to have fine motor function. That also has to coincide with language that you have immediate access to and vocabulary, even understanding and applying all the rules that come to play when you are going through the physical act of writing. And so when we're thinking about challenge and writing, one is just to honor if it's an unbelievably beautifully challenging thing to do, which is to put thoughts on paper or thoughts on the screen. And as language is both receptive and expressive, right? The receptive forms of language are reading and listening, and the expressive forms of language are speaking and writing. Just all that kind of comes together for a young writer that might feel challenging to them. And also when you're asking them to embrace a bit of challenge. I think the other two things is this idea of a common barrier to writing is just discipline and routine. I think it's Donald Murray's writing students that have this line taped on their writer's notebooks and computers, which is never a day without a line. I know that Lester Lamanek talks about just like get your butt in the seat and write. Just it is a very disciplined ritual. And I think a barrier to writing is just lack of practice, lack of ritual. And I think the third reason is that it's very psychological. Thinking about every time I sit down to write, and I know other writers feel the same way, and I know our kids must feel the same way, is that I can't do this. Like I can't sit and what do I really have to say about this? And so I think that when we're talking about challenge for the next 30 minutes, just also honoring what's hard for students as they do go to sit and express their ideas on paper or on screen, that in the mind, it's a really difficult thing to do. It also takes a lot of discipline and routine, and know that this is a vulnerable space. And I loved what Julia said in the beginning of like, we have to share this vulnerability, as kids read and write with us, it is vulnerable. And for us to join in that, I think is helpful.
And what does that look like, right? For a teacher to be vulnerable, it might mean that you can't be in control all the time of what the outcomes are, of the way that they do it, the frequency. So how do we rethink different supportive structures? That's going to be our segue into our next portion. Our first is intentional language supports. So we're going to think about, in reading and in writing, what are some intentional ways of supporting student development when it comes to language, about reading and writing specifically. And I love what Maggie was saying about what are the ways that students have that internal fear that they got to work through, the vulnerability that accompanies every bold move. How can we support them in being bolder, but then making sure that we are showing them the ways that we are taking a step in that direction too, so that it becomes, again, something that we are doing with them, not to them. Okay, so on this slide, I've actually got a little emoji story that I wrote after NCTE 17. And something that I do quite often with students, but then also just with my homies in my WhatsApp chat, is we will retell something that happened just through emojis. And that's just something that I like to do. But I also saw one time in the bookstore several Shakespearean plays told only in emojis. So why is that important? One of the ways that folks encourage students to respond to reading or to react to reading is through knowledge. What do you remember? So we'll either have them tell us what they remember or write what they remember. We will also ask them to describe or explain details. And then that puts the teacher in the position of saying, whether the details that are described are actually accurate or not. Some of this is going to have to do with perception, right? And as Maggie was mentioning, writing is a way that you are sort of capturing your lived experience on the page, but it's also a way of capturing collective memory. So how does one individual experience something that happens to a collective of people? From there, we are applying, students will often apply the skills that they have learned to reading a text. They'll analyze a text. We'll usually have some sort of analytical essay that they've got to write about what they read. We'll ask for them to, we will evaluate them typically. And then we'll also ask them to create something. And so as we take them through these stages, when it relates to reading, if we really carefully look at each one of those stages, it always ends in the teacher being the one to decide whether that actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go ahead.
Thank you. I'm like taking notes with everything that Julia is saying, and I'm in charge of the slides. I have to learn and do the slides.
I also
so
have
just
my
to
notebook
yell
ready.
at me when I'm like, just writing down everything you're saying to advance this slide.
No problem. And I'll do the same for you and to you. So one of the things that I've done and I like to do is to just use the simple symbology, right? Exclamation point, period, question mark. So what is something that really stood out for you? What is something that confirmed what you already knew? And then what's a question that you have about what you read? So that's not specifically language, but symbology is a part of language. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I like to use as a practical strategy for getting a very quick response to something students have read. Listening dyads are a way that we can practice what I like to call the disrespected and underutilized skill of listening, which is where you do not say anything. You just sit there and you listen to your partner talking to you about what they have read. And it's so interesting when I see students do this. They struggle because they want so badly to react to what the person said. And often in the act of reacting, you do wind up taking the person's story from them. You do wind up kind of taking what they're saying and making it your own. Part of that is human interaction, but I do think that we can hone our skills of listening a little bit better. And one way that I have done that with students is to have a listening dyad where they take 2 minutes and each partner takes a turn listening only and limiting hand movements and facial expressions as the other person talks about what they have read. Constructivist listening dyads is the official word for that, or phrase for that. Sentence starters can be both helpful and harmful. I have used sentence starters in seminars, specifically with second language learners, to help them get more comfortable with having the language of literature to talk about literature. However, sentence starters can also be a crutch. So it is very important, I think, at a certain point in the year or semester to just remove the sentence starters. And folks need to, at that point, have had enough practice that they feel comfortable moving beyond and using the language that they have practiced to talk about what they've read. And then reciprocal learning is something that happens in my classroom. I would have an inner circle and an outer circle, your typical fishbowl. And the outer circle folks would actually have a back channel conversation in a shared Google Doc. In that shared Google Doc, they would type specific things that their peers said, and they would react to them, either with the symbology. They could use emojis. They would say, I love this, and they would use different colors to react to what people said. So when I'm listening to students having the conversation in the fishbowl, I'm on the outside just transcribing key moments of what students said. I'm also popping into the shared document that the rest of the class has their back channel conversation going so that I can see and monitor a little bit of what the dialogue is that's happening about the student-led conversation that's happening in the middle. And then the final thing that I think it's really important to talk and think about is how often do we encourage difference of opinion or dissent in the classroom? And this is the area where a lot of teachers get uncomfortable. And so this goes back to fear and vulnerability. If you are unable to let students engage in an intense conversation where there is a difference of opinion without having to control it, that is problematic, I think. I think systems and structures can be put in place where students have the language to say things like, I respectfully disagree with you, or I'd like to push back on that. So they have the language of dissent so that they can have that differing opinion without it turning into a brawl. Because there is such a thing as productive difference or productive argument that can happen during these conversations about books and passages in text. And when our students aren't encouraged to have differing opinions, I do think that's a way that teachers unintentionally disempower them. And also we wind up with a populace that just knows how to agree with each other on the surface while covering feelings of disagreement. Okay.
So if we think about the writing side of it, how to support ourselves, our students with language supports that allow them to take on the challenge of writing or to push themselves into a space where they have more agency around their writing. I was thinking about 3 categories. One is genre. Do I have the language to talk about this genre that I'm writing in? And the way I thought I would explain but what I mean is just to share an anecdote. This is a brand new book out from one of my beloved mentors, Greg Mitchie, and I got to hear him speak at 57th Street Books in Hyde Park in Chicago, I guess this past week, same as it never was. And I could spend the whole rest of the time talking about this book, but I want to think about it's a professional text from Teachers College Press for teachers and for readers. And if I think about the way that Greg was talking about genre, it's narrative nonfiction, and he talked about how when he talked about writing this book, that it was a chronological narrative, that as he was teaching, Greg returned back to the middle school classroom that he taught for 10 years plus in the back of the yards neighborhood, went and was a professor for 10 years essentially, and now has been back in the same school for 10 years. It's just an incredible story.
So was that classroom sort of like a through line? And then through the experience of that classroom, there were all of these lessons that came out of it?
Right. So he started writing and documenting his time back in as notes from a teacher's return to the classroom. And when he talked about structuring the table of contents, at one point, he was saying how it had a totally different format, but he was living the year as a teacher. And so the events guided the TOC, right? So when Ferguson happened, it's like the events of our world guided his structure. And he talked about how in this genre of a teacher's recollection of returning to the classroom, that he's writing against the narrative of teacher as savior, and that this is not a book about answers. And as someone who writes, what I mean? And as someone who writes or attempts to write, decent books for teachers that help and are practical and have heart, I liked the way that this writer talked about the genre of books that help teachers in the classroom, that reflect the experience of kids. And it only energized me as a writer, right? To hear the language he used about the genre he chose to document his knowledge, wisdom, and questions in, right? And so I'm thinking about, for kids, do they have the language to talk about the genre that they're writing in? So if they are composing a graphic novel, do they have that language of, I'm writing not just a story, but a visual story, a symbolic stories. And I think that when we have language to talk about this genre that we're writing within, it inspires us to take that on.
That's an empowering move. Yeah, I remember teaching Persepolis and giving them a list of graphic novel terms just because I wanted them to be able to talk about it like professionals.
Yes.
So talk about it the same way that a published graphic novelist is talking about it. I love that.
Yeah, because you're right, language, helps me embody the role of someone powerful within that, and having that language is huge. If we, this whole workshop could just be on language, this framework that Julie helped us sculpt of language to help, systems to help, power. I was also thinking about process. Do I have language to talk about my process when I'm engaging in writing? And this is where the internet just wins. This is a recent post from a Facebook friend and colleague, Christina, and she wrote out there, friends who write, over the years I've learned I love revising. I absolutely do not love drafting. Revision is fascinating, engaging process in which I find joy. Getting words on a blank page is painful to me, but revising these words is like solving an intricate puzzle. Is it just me? What's your preference? And all of a sudden, all these people start chiming in on their preference, where you learn that Shauna Coppola is I'm revising all the way, and Colleen Cruz and myself are team revision. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Jeff Anderson and Kate, who says I'm a drafter all the way. And I also think about that when I think about embracing like the challenge of writing. Do I own the language of my process?
Mm-hmm.
Do I have the language that articulates my process? For me, I am structure is a blind spot for me as a writer. And if I don't have language to say that, I can't see structure. It's a blind spot. I need someone to help me think that through. It doesn't help me get over the challenge. It just helps me like sink into some shame. And self-doubt.
Language is power. And Paulo Freire has quite a bit in Pedagogy of the Oppressed about how language is power, and taking away someone's language takes away their power. So how empowering when we give folks that language to be clear about exactly what you're saying. Process. I love that.
So now I'm just like, drafting is ridiculously hard. And so I love to co-write with people where drafting is their superpower. And again, do kids have a sense to talk about themselves in all the spaces of their writing? Like, what is it like for you when you're brainstorming, collaborating? What's your strength? What's hard for you? And then two, I guess the last is, do I have the language to talk about craft? I lived in Brooklyn for, I think just over a decade, and moved away a couple of years ago. And one of the first, to be honest with you, I didn't miss it as much as I thought I would, until I went to the Mark Twain house and heard Jackie Woodson speak on her new book. And I
get to meet her tonight. I'm so excited.
Amazing. The way she talks about everything makes me want to be right there, and not in a creepy way, but just like I like how she talks about Brooklyn. I like how she talks about her writing. And so if I just, talk about the way that she spoke about her craft, when somebody in the audience asked her, your language sings such a song across the pages of your books. And do you read it out loud to yourself as you're composing? Is there an element of that? And then just to hear her speak about the cadence of her language and the process of her crafting narrative writing that does dance across the page and into the
I'm going to just take this moment, Maggie, to just promo. I mean, her book is phenomenal, and everybody needs to read it. Go get it today. So I'm just taking this moment to do product placement, and here it is. It's so beautiful. It's exactly what you were just describing, singing across the pages of this book.
Singing across the pages. And she was like, yeah, I don't know if I read it out loud. I can't exactly remember. I don't want to get her words wrong, but again, she just had language over her craft and style. And again, that is only generative power for someone who's tackling writing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wrote copious notes, so thank you very much. We're going to segue now into attaching systems and structures. So we're calling this attaching systems and structures, but really you can kind of think of it as a way of cushioning the unfamiliar with what is familiar. Again, going back to that idea of fear and how fear will immobilize people, and how a lot of times when you want to seek challenge yourself, or a student wants to seek challenge, all they need is some reassurance that the fall is going to be a little softer. I'm going to just drop into story time quickly here. I went stand-up paddleboarding once in Costa Rica, and I remember that the water, first of all, I had never done this before in my life, and the water was so warm that when I fell off, which was many times, it was like just falling into this warm pillow embrace. I didn't even mind because the water temperature had to have been upper 70s, maybe low 80s. And it was just incredible. And I just fell off and I didn't even mind and I got right back on. It's different than when you fall off and there's this really cold, freezing water, or when you're snowboarding, which I like to do too, you fall off and it's this hard smack usually and the ground is really cold. So it's a very different experience. So when we're thinking about attaching systems and structures, think about the known, think about the unknown, think about how do we seek challenge? What does challenge look like? And then how can we make that experience of diving into challenge as unscary, as welcoming as possible? So when we think about some things that we do a lot with connection to reading instruction, reading conferences is something that is kind of a standard practice when it comes to reading instruction. Seminars and paired discussions, I spoke a little bit about, and we'll talk more about that. Listening structures also spoke about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then student-driven text selection, which to me is something that I'm really diving into as a librarian. What makes a student take a book off the shelf? What makes them go back? I've already learned that getting a recommendation from a peer is big. That is like probably top 5 of the things that will make a student choose a text. Having the teacher prescribe or demand that student read the text is maybe top 3 of what will make them not want to do it or read it or engage with it, unless they've already got an established relationship with that teacher and they trust the teacher kind of knows the type of thing that I will like and is doing this not out of a sense of teacher, I don't know, let's call it teacher control mechanisms where, you know, we're trying to match a reader with what we think is best for them and doing it in a way that we think is sneaky and surreptitious, but underestimating someone's ability to catch on to our sneaky ways, probably not the best idea. So student-driven text selection, that's fascinating for me as a librarian. And then collaborative annotation, what I'll talk a little bit more about that, but what that looks like is that you're stepping back, again, out of the process of annotation. And it isn't something that is being passed from student to teacher for teacher to judge, and then that's it. That's the closed continuum, right? Instead, it turns into a loop of reciprocity where people are having this ongoing conversation in the annotation about a text. And I'll talk more about how that happens on the next slide. So on the top left, or maybe it's your right, you'll see Bookface Friday and Bookstagram. Those are 2 hashtags that are pretty popular right now. I love Bookface Friday. I just wish that there were more people of color, but it also, you get a really good sense for how few books have people of color on the cover. I think that that's starting to happen more. But if you just look up that Bookface Friday hashtag, primarily on Instagram, but a little bit on Twitter too, you can see pictures like these where folks have taken a book cover and they've positioned it over themselves in order to create a sort of piece of art. And so in a way that is interacting with the book, even if it's just interacting with the cover. Students, my students, are all about social media, of course. I think everyone's are. They grew up in a time when there wasn't the absence of social media. So acknowledging that social media is now a part of folks' reading lives, I find that that's more proactive than ignoring it and saying, here's your reading life and identity, which is separate from social media. Finding ways to bring the 2 together has really worked well for me as a librarian. Actively Learn is an interesting site where you can actually upload anything you want to the platform, and then it will allow you to put in comprehension questions, annotation prompts, a variety of different things, but it makes the text more interactive. So I like having students actually drop in the text that they would like us to study as a whole group. So it's not always me selecting the text, and it will do various things like analyze the text for Lexile and all those other things that teachers like to do. But it's a way for students to read collaboratively, and it makes the text interactive. Now Comment is the same type of thing, but it's a little bit less, it's not necessarily, you don't have to have a live web page. Actively Learn works best when you have an article that is web-based that you drop into it. Now Comment works really well just from a Google Doc. I remember putting Dulce et Decorum Est in there from a Google Doc, and then all the kids on the side were annotating, and they had to go in and make comments on each other's annotations. And so it wasn't for the purpose of, let me do this individually and get my grade. It became a reciprocal exchange between students. And then we decided as a group, what is a solid annotation? And then the far right, you'll see Goodreads. And we all know about Goodreads. We all know how an author's worst nightmare is to go on Goodreads and read what somebody has said where they've just eviscerated something that folks poured their heart into. So I don't want to focus on that element of Goodreads. Instead, there is a closed group setting where you can actually have a virtual reading group. So you can say, okay, my third and fifth period classes, I'd like them to actually talk to each other because I know that they're both reading Native Son. So you'll put in a picture of Native Son. You will have opportunity for them. It gives you the opportunity for them to engage with each other. They create a username and there's a space for threaded discussion and for them to upvote each other's comments. If they can't do that, that used to be a feature, but you can still find a way for them to react to one another's comments. And there are many other platforms. These are not the only ones, but these are the ones that have worked for me. And then you'll see in the picture down below, inner circle, outer circle. In this particular one, they are reading The Hate You Give and they're talking about it. But you can see that some of them have Chromebooks. So the outer circle folks were having a back channel conversation with their Chromebooks while the inner circle folks were discussing the book. So again, merging technology with text has worked really well for me. When we're thinking about old systems, trying to bring them into conversation with new systems. Yeah, something like that.
I just feel like Julia is a librarian to so many students, but like Julia is like my librarian. You know, like she is like, I feel like she is, can I get people talking about on Twitter? She's like the teacher's librarian. I want to just stop here and ask more questions about that, but I'm going to quickly do the second half of that, which are
Maggie, we're being told we have 5 minutes.
I know, I'm gonna go super fast.
Okay.
Super fast.
Okay,
so old systems, reimagining them to create spaces for kids to take on more ownership, more agency, have more challenge within. We can encourage students to, find their own writing mentors, their own mentor texts. My true north is writing workshop. And if I think about a landmark book that taught me about how to take on a teacher of writing, I think about Katie Wood Ray's Wondrous Words, where she was, really talked a lot about, making sure kids have a vision of what they want to write. And so if I think a lot of times when I'm in the classroom, I'm the selector of the mentor text. Like I'm the one who's like, this is an amazing example of poetry. I was just doing some work with Naomi Shihab Nye's work this week out in Chicago. But again, if I think about what Julia in this presentation is trying to encourage us to think about, we want to make sure that kids are encouraged to find their own so that they can bring in voices that inspire. We want to challenge students to republish their writing in new genres or new forms or modalities. One of the people that helped me originally think about that was Tom Romano's work of multi-genre writing. I think about Troy Hicks's work a lot, who was presenting earlier in the day of helping kids think about how I would take a research report and maybe republish it in a different online form, such as an infographic or a photo essay or a historical documentary. And so again, kids can publish from the ground up multi-genre writing, but it's also interesting to think about, I have this poem, I have this story. What would it take as a writer to republish it in a totally different format? And what choices do I need to make to fit the rules of that new space? And then helping students create visions of independent writing projects. Again, if I throw back, 15 plus years with this slide, I think about Colleen Cruz's work on independent writing, where yes, we can teach kids how to write within units of study, but kids can also seek out the kinds of independent writing projects they want to do on their own, like creating a family recipe book or creating a collection of poems. So these kind of older systems of structures that tend to be really, in a good way, old hat in writing classrooms, we can think about bringing kids more into that. Or if we feel locked into our writing just teaching within genres and units, again, creating space of 10 minutes a day where kids can create and write their own writing projects. And voices like Penny Kittle and Kelly Gallagher and Linda Reef are ones that encourage us to keep that part going.
I love it. We're just going to just zip through these. Okay. So I'm just going to go like this. Okay. So shifting power. Go ahead. Boom. So if we have done this, where we are always determining the levels of challenge and what students need in order to move between them, then we can try to empower them by collaborating to formulate levels of challenge as a community, and then determining together, okay, what do we need to move beyond these levels? And then we can support students by maximizing their strengths to use in service of their peers. So how do you have reading role models? How do you go beyond just putting someone's paper on a wall and saying, this is our writing exemplar? What does it look like to take the person in the class who maybe has the least confidence about their writing, pinpoint an area that they do very, very well, and then have other folks learning from that student? What are the ways that we can maximize our strengths to use them in the service of others? Boom, next slide. Okay, so reading rubrics, co-constructed rubrics. I don't think we have too much time to talk about this, but that's where we construct the rubric together with the students. And then it changes throughout the year as our definition of excellence changes throughout the year.
Yes.
Okay.
So in terms of rethinking assessment and agency and power shifting in writing, typical patterns of instruction and curriculum can lead students to write for an audience of one. The teacher can help, encourage students to move lockstep through a unit when they might need more time drafting, or they may need more time revising. They might be unaware of where they are in the writing process or their writing process. It may feel like a strategy a day type of thing, or they're receiving a grade without opportunities of revision. And so thinking about, as you teach writing this year, could you open up the audience and make sure that it's not an audience of one? Could we have more fluent movement through a unit of study, a la Nancy Atwell's work decades ago? Could kids define their own writing process? Don Murray helped us really think a lot about a writing process. And sometimes when we're in schools, we standardize that process. But again, we have voices like Ralph Fletcher and Tom Newkirk that are encouraging us to go back and have kids move through their own process, or even escape the confines of an assigned genre, where students can choose strategies that fit under a larger goal. And we could challenge the concept of what is a finished piece of writing, which I feel like, again, could tie back to what Julie alluded to, which is the co-constructed rubrics. But for now,
we've got
Julia,
1 minute.
Take us out.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute. So I know I seek challenge when I have the language I need to express my ideas. I can see familiarity in the unfamiliar, and then I know how to access and use my personal power. So that's what we really want to leave you with. And then we've got resources. So take a picture, do what you would like to, but these are some books that have inspired us to really think about how to support students in being intrinsically motivated, disrupting that teacher-centric, teacher at the top, one person holding all of the power and expecting the other to take all the moves to be vulnerable. How can we disrupt that and change it? That's really what we want to leave you with here today.
All right. Yay. We did it. Okay. That was amazing, incredible. You guys were blowing up Twitter, just so you know. You can go back later and check out all the tweets. If I had to do an emoji recap of your session, it would be there would be a book, computer, notebook, microphone, the mind blown emoji, heart eyes, and of course praise hands because I was doing a lot of nodding and like, yes.
I like those.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites.
So thank you so much both for your time and your words and your ideas. I know everybody watching was inspired. They're wanting to try these things out with their own kids. So if you are watching live and you popped in the middle, don't worry. We have recorded the entire session. So we will archive it on the Ed Colab site. You can watch it from beginning to end, share with your colleagues. And then at this time, we have a quick break, just enough time for you to get up and stretch. Get ready for our closing session with Min Lay, the closing keynote starting at 3 Eastern, just a few minutes away. So again, Julia, Maggie, thank you so much for your time today. And everyone else, we will see you soon.
Thanks for having us. Bye.